begin. Thank you, everybody, for calling in. Good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you are or whether you're listening to this live or on tape delay. Welcome to the fourth PT LEAP webinar on transformative change. Ryan Austin, Deputy Director of LEAP, and we're delighted to have as our webinar moderator today Marie Schall from the Institute for Healthcare Improvement, where she directs improvement and innovation projects focused on outpatient-based care. Marie's also a National Advisory Committee member for our project, which is primary care teams from effective ambulatory practices. PCT LEAP, a national program of the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, and is located at McCall Center for Healthcare Innovation here at Group Health Research Institute. Today, we're going to hear from 3 LEAP sites about their experiences in transformative change. Before we do, I'd like to encourage you to all actively use the chat boxes located on your screen. Ask questions or make comments that the moderators can then pose at the end of each presentation. In order to see the chat box, you may need to move your cursor to the extreme top of your computer screen and click on the chat icon that will appear there. In the chat box, note the Send To line. If you click on downward arrow to display the menu, scroll down and select the All Attendees option so everyone can see your comments and questions, and we can try to answer as many questions as possible. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the PCT LEAP's Commons website soon after. And for those questions that we don't get to, we'll be noting what's in the chat box, and we'll also try to follow up on answered questions on the PCT LEAP Commons. So here's the agenda for today. You'll see from the agenda that it's tightly packed for 1 hour. We'll have 3 presentations with an opportunity for questions and comments between the presentations and at the end. And again, please chat your questions and comments into the chat box. And at this time, I'd like to welcome Marie Schall. Marie?
Thanks, Ryan, and welcome everybody. Very pleased to be here and to have you all with us today for this session. I'm just going to do a little bit of context setting and set us up for the presentations and the discussion. You know, as we were getting ready for session, discussions that I had with Judith Schaefer and Ed Wagner and Austin and the team at McCall, I mean, I think the most interesting part of this discussion is really, in a sense, sort of a definitional one or a conceptual one. So the subject is transformative change, and immediately that raised for me the question is, well, what do we mean by that? Does it mean, as is suggested in the little summary that or overview that you all received for the call? You know, does it mean that the change needs to be sort of multi-dimensional as opposed to very discrete? Does it mean that there needs to be measurable improvement in health outcomes? You know, I guess sort of from a layman's terms, when you think about something being transformative, you immediately think, well, it's different in some way. It's got to be some kind of big difference. But the I think for us is, how do you know when something is transformative? How do you know whether you've gotten there? Are we thinking about something that's a process, so it's a process of transformation, or is it an endpoint? So there's some kind of transformative endpoint that you reach. So there's lots of questions, I think, do with this topic, which is why I think it's so interesting, and I'm so looking forward to hearing from the presenters. I think we can all together explore this topic and hopefully get a clearer understanding of what it is and help us all in that process. We also think that the process, as we talked about it, probably has something to do with a few things: leadership, quality improvement, and by that we're saying just using data for looking at data, but really how do you build learning organizations? Continuous learning is what goes on. it has something to do with moving just from a project orientation to really looking at how a change or a set of changes really changes in a fundamental way what goes on in a practice. So we're going to be seeing lots of different aspects of this topic today, and as I said, we'll be exploring it together. So really invite you to come to this with an open mind and with a curiosity about the topic and learning from our presenters. I think we're ready to go ahead and move into the first presentation.
Well, let me introduce all panelists so you know who you're listening to. Say we have 3 presentations. The first will be by Andy Tremblay, who's chairman of the Department of Primary Care at Dartmouth-Hitchcock-Keene Clinic, which is in southwestern New Hampshire. Second will be Thad Schilling, medical director for the Patient-Centered Medical Home and chief of internal medicine at Harvard Vanguard Medical Associates in Medford, Massachusetts, just north of Boston. And third will be Ryan Ebersol, who's Senior VP of Mission, and Linda Thomas, who's President and CEO of the Wright Center for Primary Care in northwestern Pennsylvania. So at this point, Andy, we're going to pass it to you.
Thanks, Brian. You can go ahead and throw up my first slide there. First of all, I just want to welcome everybody and set up just a brief context of the slides that we'll try to get through them very quickly so that people can ask questions, and I'll do my best to answer them all. So I was asked to discuss, in particular, one of our projects here around hypertension, how we use data to help us make decisions and make changes, and in particular, sort of an outlying group that really needed a little extra help with this, and how the data sort of changed their view on things and helped move into the realm of the rest of our department, which I think is something that we'll have to contend with when we make changes. There's people who are going to be resistant, and are going to be people who need to have additional tools in what you put in place. So I'll set a little background for you. Brian, you can throw up first slide. 2012, a decision was made by our campus here, which is a combination of both a hospital and ambulatory setting, that hypertension was really a goal, of something we wanted to improve. However, we felt that this was not something that could just live in primary care. It had to be a campus-wide effort. They made a priority in every department, so everybody sat at the table from all of the representatives from all of the departments, including orthopedics, dermatology. They were all at the table. We started trying to understand the process where we were, and it was very clear that across our campus we had a number of ways that people were obtaining, documenting pressure, as well as just making sure people were competent. And I would just throw this as an aside. I think probably one of the most astounding things we learned from this was that we started to look at the equipment we had at our campus. 7% of our blood pressure cuffs were either not calibrated appropriately or were broken. And that's something we did not anticipate in our initiation of this process. So you never know what you're going to find. During any type of process improvement, one of the things that we initially did was, after understanding where we were and where we wanted to go, we started to look at the barriers that were present to providing the effective care that we wanted to deliver. And those barriers ranged anywhere from the patient barriers to provider barriers to staff barriers to equipment barriers and physical barriers. And we sort of plan in place for each one of those and sort of moved through them. Next, Ryan. I put this up because I thought it would be quick, because the rest of the data is sort of in multiple slides. But what I'd like to bring your attention to is how we're structured here. We have sort of teams A, B, C, and D there in our main clinic. And we have 2 sort of satellite clinics, one in Walpole and one in Winchester. This data that you're seeing up there is our data at the top, and in yellow is our current data as of December of 2013. But you can see here that the graphs on the bottom go all the way back through September of 2012. And to bring your attention to the orange bar, that is sort of the low bar that's set there back in 2012. And you can see that they remained at about the same without any substantial improvement for quite a period of time as we instituted this process. Sort of what I wanted to share with you. So what things were in place prior to September 12th is a compensation change had been made here for provider compensation to try to drive people toward improving and working on their own process of improvement by sort of linking 5% of their total compensation here to achieving hypertensive control of greater than 79%. At the time, it was actually targeted greater than 80. And so that incentive alone was put in place in January of 2012. As you can see, that particular bar remained fairly flat, but other people actually started to increase and improve above that mark. So it did drive some people, but it was not a driver for the people in our Walpole office. I just wanted to give you that visual snapshot for those people. Go ahead to the next slide, Brian. We identified these barriers, as I mentioned earlier. As a global campus, we started to develop strategies to overcome them, both regionally and within our own department. But it was obvious in that orange bar is the example that one part of was really sort of slow to come along there, despite the improvements that we're seeing. So what ended up happening with that was we ended up spending some additional time with them and going down and understanding what the barriers that they were experiencing versus the other aspects of our campus were experiencing. So what ended up happening for them was that they had a real hard time understanding that having another system in place, having a registry coordinator, or in a case, a registry coordinator, but certainly some of the things we've heard in our discussions in other parts of MAs or other people helping to manage their panels, was not something that they were really willing to give up. And they continued to feel as providers that they owned everything and they owned everything alone. So money really was not a driving factor for them. It was really more about they could see so many patients in a day, and despite the fact that they really tried to deliver the best care possible to all the patients they were seeing by engaging in these other initiatives that we were working on, they were missing out on a whole grouping of patients that they were actually not physically in contact with. So what we did was we sort of helped them to understand the consistency that these tools provided and showed them several data slides along the way about individual providers and departments and how clinics had become more busy. And they felt much more reassured by seeing that rather than just saying, hey, 5% of your salary is linked, to your improvement in this. But in seeing the successes that other practice had enjoyed, they began to see themselves actually as sort of an outlier in this effort. And it's pretty clear from those slides that they really were quite an outlier. At one point, for those of you that are in the emerging leaders, I had done a presentation and showed you our superstar board that showed the stars where everybody had sort of moved over time and gotten up there above this 80%. The two of the four practitioners down in Walpole that were actually off the board, they were below 60%, on around 58 or 59%, and had remained so for years. But started to see themselves as outliers and had come to understand that there's a way we can help improve this without burdening their particular responsibilities. They leapt on board. And, Brian, can go back to that slide for a second, the slide before, that would be great. You can see right around February of 13 where we really started to work with these folks from February 2013 all the way through August, and then the rest of the data is on the slide that I didn't include up until December of 13. They remained at about 83 to 84% since that time, simply by having that more intimate discussion about what was unique for them and how they might better take part of the go ahead.
About Andy.
Yep.
Huh?
At the end, that's the end of the slide. So really, it was a win. They're now on par with all the other portions of our practice. So two things. One, they were really reassured by the success of the group as a whole, and came to sort of find that there is value in learning new techniques and allowing other people to participate in the care of our patients. And also, just aside, for them, it was a bit of a financial win as well because they were able to achieve that metric, and so they had income improvement as well. So a very brief run of something that took us quite a bit of time to establish, but I hope I've touched on some of the key points.
Thank you much. And we're asking folks to send questions in the chat box. And Marie, anything before we get to the box? Any from you?
Well, thanks, Brian. And yes, I'm watching the chat as well to see if there's any questions that come up. But I guess while people are thinking, let me ask Andy. That really is a very exciting story, and I would say that Walpole practice, that their perspective on improvement was transformed, perhaps. They became engaged, and I mean, I can certainly hear the excitement in your voice, and I'm sure that they were excited too as they got involved in the process. So I wondered if you would say a little bit more about what you think contributed to that. You explained how you shared the comparative data, how they began to see themselves not only as outliers, but also that there was a way that they could, as you said, take some steps to begin to change without being overburdened. Can you talk about the role of perhaps the leadership in the practice, a little bit more about what the process was really like for them to really have this transformed kind of perspective on their work?
So the uniqueness of that practice is that it's actually made up of four providers, one being a nurse practitioner who's fairly new, other three having a total of 65 years of service to our community, and have been practicing in this setting for quite some time and sort of just doing their own thing for a really long time. And it really was never an issue, let's say 15 years ago. We really did not measure things beyond RVU and productivity and things like that. It wasn't really so much about quality 15, 20 years ago, as it's become much more since that time. So it was sort of a culture change, for them. And the center, if you will, of that particular group is also heavily involved in the education of medical students from Dartmouth and is constantly working with them. And as they began to show their data, I think what actually applied some pressure to him was that his students were learning many of the things that we're talking about now about team-based care, and that it can't just rest on the shoulders of one or two people. So they began to actually prompt him with questions about how come Walpole wasn't improving, despite the fact that they all seemed to be so dedicated and caring, to their patients. And it began to get him thinking that there has to be a different way to do this. And it really involved him sort of breaking out of the model of using his staff in that setting as just people to answer phone calls and put patients in rooms, and utilize their skill sets in a different way in terms of outreaching to people that were not necessarily coming in for care day, but ensure that we were keeping tabs of our patients that might have not have an appointment for a year, but may something today. And that was quite opening for him, and actually has lifted a bit of the burden, because he has a fairly large panel, having been here for 20 plus years. Any of them are aging and have multiple complex medical issues, and this system that we're trying to evolve even further into other disease processes has some burden in his thought process.
We are getting some questions built up, so let me take a shot at combining two. Andy, folks are interested in specifically how the Walpole practice did things differently in the use of primary care team members. So you're talking about outreach, but specifically, what did that look like?
As I say, in other parts of which we've been really excited to learn about, there are sort of these podlets or team-based care where there's an MA responsible for some of that outreach. Here, we're very short on MAs and very sort of long on RN work, but we have developed sort of a mini department within primary care. We call them our registry coordinators. And registry coordinators are assigned to each team. So there's, as you saw earlier, there's A, B, C, and D. So each team has its own registry coordinator, and each satellite has its own registry coordinator. And they didn't really understand what that registry coordinator person needed to do until I was able to get down to them and show them, talk to them more about the function of the registry coordinator. So what the registry coordinator is they basically generate registries of whatever it is that we're looking at. If we're looking at pneumothorax, if we're looking at fall risk, if we're looking at depression, hypertension in this case, they generate the list and they provide that information to the doc. And they spend half hour once a month and provided the physician or nurse practitioner in this case with that information to review, and then they get together and decide on the next steps and the plans of action for them. And the reason why that was quite different for them is that they really looked at providing medical care as simply, I got to do today's work today. And, we've learned about that as sort of the old template. I'm going to worry about what's in front of me today and what ends up in my inbox and outbox, but in population health, the whole cadre of patients that are out there that may never cross your path, but have requirement of services. So using that registry coordinator for them was huge, and actually engaging them and not feeling disconnected from that, though they had a significant say in the management of that patient.
Great. Thank
You betcha.
Yeah, Brian.
I'm wondering. We've got a question of about specific barriers that they encountered, and I'm wondering if there's anything else you can say about on the path to this conversion, barriers that they found.
So, when we talk initially, if we take out what I've already said, which is sort of the provider barriers, which was just sort of overcoming our own internal culture, if you will, about how we practice medicine and being willing to or able to adapt to new models, there were definitely some other barriers. And some of those barriers were, and having suddenly someone outreach from an office when you're doing in your world fine, but to notify you that, hey, we're aware that your last blood pressure at the clinic was 170/90 in the orthopedics department, but you're not scheduled to see Dr. S until 9 months from now. We were wondering if you might be willing to come by and have your blood pressure rechecked because we're concerned about that. So that was a barrier in and of itself, was sort of getting patients to interact with the medical system in a different way. So there was a lot of prep work that went out about that, several note cards type devices we made, and brochures went out to all of our patients with hypertension. In addition, there were some physical barriers, and one of them being monetary. To make patients come in routinely obviously creates some kind of potential issue for having co-pays, and so I know some places that's just not an issue. They do it for free, but here that was always an issue, trying to create a singular system. And we have some docs, not just in Walpole, but others that would write an order that said, come to nurse clinic for a free blood pressure check. Other docs would say, come to the nurse clinic for a blood pressure check, and the nurses never knew whether they should be charging for a nurse visit or what they should be doing. So we actually sat down and wrote policy here that said all care around, beyond the office visit with a physician practitioner or PA involving hypertension would be considered, quote, free care. So there are no copays, and we do not charge patients for that work. If they're coming in to get their blood pressure checked or education is occurring, we don't charge them. And the reason we've chosen to do that is because we're trying to get to a model of what we call bundled care. So if you look at it that way, it's what it looks like to be a hypertensive patient in Keene, New Hampshire. These are the services you get for essentially what your insurance is going to pay for us to do that. So that was another barrier. And then, as I mentioned, we did have some equipment barriers. So they had some cuffs that were in excess of 15 to 20 years old in Walpole, and so we had to go down and actually see that most of them were not calibrated and were actually physically not functioning with ripped Velcro and sphygmomanometers that weren't working, and so we had to deal with purchase of new equipment and standardize that across our campus, which is 120 providers of all specialties. So those were some of the other barriers that we encountered and how we overcame them.
Yes, thank you much, Andy. This is Marie. We did have a question, and Ed, you had chatted it in early in the discussion, and I don't know whether you feel that Andy's addressed it, but you asked about what the Walpole practice actually do differently now to improve the control. Looking for a little bit more specifics there, or has Andy addressed what you had in mind?
Ed, you're on mute. We can circle back to that, but to keep on time, can we go to that and then see if we have time at the end? Since
that's good.
Okay. All right. The second presenter is Killing of Harvard Vanguard Medical Associates. Take it away.
Thank you, Marie, and thank you for having me today. So I want to go back to a comment that Marie made at the beginning of the call here, which was asking really what, in our view, makes it feel like we've transformed. And I spend more time talking about process than I am about content. So Andy gave a great example of taking a content area and going really deep and showing how transformative their management is in hypertension. I just stay at a slightly higher level about the processes that we used, which I think really are the engine around our transformation. So there'll be less on content, more on process. And really, it's impossible to start the conversation about transformation without talking about our improvement methodology. And so really, from the very beginning, we invested a lot of time, effort, energy, money in developing competencies in quality improvement. We chose the lean process improvement methodology, but honestly, I don't think there's anything magical about lean. I think any process improvement methodology could be used to create the kind of deep commitment to change that we were able to realize with lean. It really gave us, though, an opportunity to have a change in our culture, one that was really more motivated around exploration and experimentation and learning and inquiry, as opposed to sort of being stuck in our sort of standard workflow ways of thinking. So we spent a lot of time trying to develop the concept of A3 thinking, which says, you know, we have to set the context for change. And context for change really was pretty grandiose, which is saying that we're trying to achieve the triple aim +1, you know, obviously the cost and quality and patient experience plus provider experience. And when we looked at where we were individually in our practice by sharing relevant data around each of those measures, it was pretty clear that we could create a case for needing transformative change in order to achieve those kinds of goals. That context was set not just locally here in the Medford practice, but also by our senior management team. So this was kind of all around us, and all the communication from the senior leaders all the way on down that we're really driving towards this shared destination of the triple aim +1, and that in fact we really have a lot of distance to travel between where we are now and where we'd like to be. And in our process, we made sure that everybody was trained in this methodology. Everybody had to participate. So not only did you have to attend the training, but when we sat down and actually talked about what was it that we need to change in the way that we work together, everybody had to participate. And so part of it sort of made participation meant that we were creating opportunities for people to come to the table. So you weren't in the regular production line seeing patients if you're a provider, or if you're a medical assistant and you're checking patients in and out. You're not doing that today. You're going to sit down with each other and talk about how it is that we work together and think with our new lean on, think about how we can improve our processes differently. And as I mentioned, we also talked a lot about developing a shared destination for where we're trying to get. And really those were all focused around the principles of the patient-centered medical home. And I think the importance of establishing not just that we're going to do things in a way that feels like a patient-centered medical home, but we're actually going to try to deliver a breakthrough performance. Not just that we're moving, work responsibilities, but that we're actually delivering care in a different way that has a measurable benefit. So that's really where we started. I wanted to share because it's a visual of all of the process changes that we have touched thus far. And I think this also speaks to transformation. Transformation for us meant that we're really hitting pretty much every process in our care delivery. And so just to orient those who aren't familiar with a fishbone, you usually put a problem at the head of the fish, and then you have all of the contributing factors to the problem along the fishbone. We actually have a solution at the head of our fish, which was our patient-centered medical home, and then all of the elements that we think collectively contribute to developing that patient-centered medical home. And we have it organized here visually into two halves. Really, on the north half of the fish, there are 5 elements there that are all about operations. And one of the things that we learned very quickly when we got people offline and together in rooms is that we realized that we needed to improve our processes. The things that we do literally tens of thousands of times a year, like answer the phone and fill prescription referrals and respond to patient requests for service. If we don't have clear roles and responsibilities within those domains, we end up just wasting a lot of time. And our patient experience is not so great because we're not all together on the same page with how we do those things. So we also looked at how patients flow through the office. So the flow management is series of interventions which is really focused on patient flow throughout the day and also information flow. For those of us in primary care, we know we're managing information as much as we're managing patients, and making sure that that happens in a streamlined way where there are clear roles and responsibilities at a team-based level really makes a huge difference. We spend a lot of time understanding our processes in planned visits. So what are we doing before visits to get ready? What are we doing after visits to close the loop? And really, how are we organizing our teams, managing our schedules and templates? So all of those elements on top are operational. And we figured that if we could understand the roles and responsibilities and perform work in a relatively standard way, that we could create capacity then to focus on the care, which is on the bottom half of the fish. If you think about it from a population standpoint, within the we have 18,500 patients in the Medford practice. Within that population, there are subpopulations that have special care needs around whom we should develop flexible care teams that provide care in a way that's different from our usual care model. And so we really focused in a couple of key areas. One was around patients with chronic illness, another in patients who had comorbid behavioral health problems, a third in the care of the high-risk, frail elders, and finally in patients who have socioeconomic disadvantages. And so we developed care models that were flexible around each of those patients, those patient populations. And really, in that way, we've touched the role and responsibility of everybody in our practice, from medical secretaries to medical assistants, nurses, nurse practitioners, social workers. Primary care is a different beast than what it used to be. And so that feels very transformative in its scope. This was an important visual because I think in a lot of ways it's hard when you're focused on the minutia of a process to see how it all connects together and how collectively that would result in a difference in a patient experience. And how also the importance of focusing on process in operations creates capacity for being able to deliver care in a more patient-centered and flexible way, which is all that work on the bottom half of the fish, so that you don't feel like you're missing out on the value of the mission if you're focused on some minute piece of work in how you process a form. The next slide, please.
Left.
The role of leadership really also changed. Instead of being in a command and control kind of environment, we were really trying to set the context and then empower teams to do work. So along the way, we had to remove a lot of barriers to this improvement. And so, for example, we decoupled clinician compensation from visit-based care to allow team-based care to truly flourish. As I mentioned, we had to take people, quote, out of the production line so that they could work on improvement. And really had to empower teams. I think in our culture, historically, management was here to solve problems. And in this context, we were trying to invite people to the table to help solve the problems that they were experiencing just as much as management was. It was, of course, a role to set the pace of change. And as you look at that fishbone, there are a lot of different elements. And so at first, we went too fast, and we had to go at a much more measured pace in future years. But it never really stops. So it's our responsibility as leaders to make sure we know how much pain we're going through as we're going through change, and really creating the opportunity to know that. So we created space for feedback and reflection. We had open lunches that we called free lunch, free speech, where you come and you eat and you also speak your mind. We acknowledged the pain of change and celebrated the success along the way, and really kept at it. I think, you can come up with a million good ideas in a room, but if you can't implement it and sustain it, then everybody loses hope and faith. So please, to the last slide, Brian. And really the ways that we worked on sustainment in the model is understanding that for each one of these processes, there is a, quote, best known way at the time, and we call that our standard work. Standard work is the best known way at the time because we anticipate that it can be improved. Once it is out and about and people are using it, we are expecting that people will tell us that there's a better way to do it. And one of the ways to ensure that we continue that improvement is to actually go and see. So you watch the people who are doing the new standard work do the work, and you participate in conversations to develop new strategies that then develop the best known way. Obviously, all requires an awful lot of data, tracking on a daily, weekly, monthly, or yearly basis to be able to celebrate success over time and to make problems in the practice visible. Whether that's looking at a process and whether it's repeatable or whether it's looking at an outcome. And just for an example, this is a slide of our diabetes composite outcomes over the course of about a year and a half, where we moved from about 40% of our patients with diabetes achieving the bundle up to about 50% over the course of about 18 months. And one of the things I was most proud of as a department is that was a sustained change. Yes, there are little blips along the screen, but it's primarily an uphill trajectory, and that's really something to celebrate, and one of the ways that we help to sustain improvement. A kind of high-level review of our elements of transformation in the Medford practice, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Well, thanks very much, Thad. And that is quite a journey, and I think you've, as I was listening, touched on a number of the components that I had suggested at the top of the hour that we kind of be on our lookout for during the discussion. So I heard, I heard the quality improvement method. I heard setting really a bold aim, and then a clear view of the destination, or at least having a destination that you have in mind. And then heard scope. So this involved, I think, has a couple aspects. One is the multidimensional aspect of what you were trying to do, as you were explained through the fishbone diagram. So certainly not just one aspect of that care delivery, but all of them. And the piece that I hadn't had a read on early, but I think you emphasized it very nicely, which was it's all transformation also involves having everyone be involved in the change. And this, of course, a reflection of sort of a broad scope, but I think emphasizing that and making that clear that you can't really have a transformed practice unless everybody is involved. And so I thought those things that you pointed out and emphasized were really important and very helpful. We do have a couple questions in the chat. One, a specific one around how you decoupled compensation from visit care.
Oh, we started with a quick and dirty, which is that our previous clinician compensation model was, in part panel size, but also RVU based. And we said, while we're doing this work, we're going to put you on a salary. We are simply going to pay you the way whatever your top earning was over the last 4 quarters, we're going to give you that for the next several years. And what's really amazing, at least in our model, is that the incentive-based compensation model doesn't really drive behavior. So most people's compensation remains fairly static. They aren't trying to just overproduce for the sake of more dollars. And really, by putting people onto a salaried model, it allowed them to come to the table thinking about rational care delivery, not thinking about what might influence their compensation at the end of the day, and kept them from having to sort of figure out, well, you spent an hour in this event and 5 hours in that event, and how do we compensate for that activity? We said, we're all in this together. We'll go on to a salaried model. And subsequently, we went back to a variable compensation model after we'd done most of the design, but allowed people to show up, I think, with a different headspace.
Thanks. And then another question regarding what kind of measures would you like to look at as you slow the process of change down going forward?
Great one. So
yeah.
we followed, they say steal shamelessly. So we stole shamelessly from health the idea of using the Maslow burnout inventory, which is a 22-item questionnaire that basically measures 3 different domains. The sense of emotional exhaustion, a sense of depersonalization, which is our inability to see patients as people. It's really just seeing them as problems. And the third is a sense of personal accomplishment. And we looked at those 3 domains at all levels of staff throughout the intervention. And what we saw was when we had turned the heat up too high and we were going too fast is that people were getting burned out. You would see emotional exhaustion scores go up. And then when we backed off on the pace a little bit and we allowed the changes to sort of take root, the notion was that eventually we should be able to make people feel less emotionally exhausted and to feel more personally accomplished. And so we did actually see a rise in those scores over the course of time once we'd made the changes that made the impact in the care delivery, but we weren't pushing so hard and so fast every one of us who's been through this process knows that after you push for a couple of months or 6 months or a year, people start to burn. So making sure you're watching and asking those questions. So as we continue to move forward, we watch the temperature, so to speak, with the Maslach burnout inventory.
That's interesting. You know, I had a question that discussion sort of prompted for me. You described sort of a change that happened between, I think you said you started out too fast and had to slow down, so this is kind of the opposite of that. But what happened in the first couple of years where you realized you needed to make an adjustment? And what were the signals of that, and then what kind of adjustments did you make?
Well, the signal was really pretty loud and clear from the people doing the work. So if you're trying to change a new process literally every month, you can't feel confident as you are doing this new process that you've got it before you're being asked to change something else. So we heard pretty clearly from people, this is hard, and we also saw that changes weren't sticking. So if you make a couple of process changes for a medical assistant about how you check a patient in, and then you make a couple of process changes about how they check out, and as soon as you focus on the checkout, you lost all your check-in standard work, that tells you something. You're going a little too fast. So we saw that process, unfortunately, play out fairly regularly over the first year, and it's also a challenge of leadership to figure out how fast you push, and my job was to balance the expectations of the senior leadership team that's looking for an outcome with the reality on the ground of how you actually get the work done. So that's one of the things we saw, and what we simply did is we slowed down the pace of change. So instead of having an event every month where we're changing something, it was more like every other, every third month. It meant that we would go back and do retraining. You assume that if you train once that people are ready to go. That's not the case. You've got to train and re-audit and continue to go back. Some of our supervisors were having difficulty keeping up with all of the auditing, which told us that we were also going too fast. So I think those were a couple of key indicators for us and a few of the changes that we made to slow things down.
Thanks for that. Move us along, since we're within a couple minutes of our scheduled time, and our third presenters from the Right Center. Brian and Linda, it's all yours.
Thank you so much. So we were actually just sitting here and we're giving a little bit of a chuckle because we're still in that phase of really identifying how many PDSAs can you get done in a day, and how many, and as we looked back over and reflected on the experiences that we've had here at the Right Center, you'll notice the picture on that first slide. We imagine what we can do with a little bit of creativity and a really good team together. So the example of our empanelment project, and if you go to the next slide, we're going to hit on just a couple of things because we want to make sure there's time for questions. So we had an experience where we had tried many different ways to actually create an empanelment project within the Right Center. And so over the course of about 3 years, we had multiple failed PDSAs. We had brought some of those projects were led by residents, some were led by physicians, some were led by individuals in the administration. Really, none of them were able to catch. So pieces of them would work, but they weren't coming together to really give us that kind of overall change within the process that we wanted. And so we got motivated by the frustration that there was no continuity within the care that the patients were receiving. This was expressed by the patients, it was expressed by the staff, it was expressed by the residents that trained in the location, and then it led us into really that changing moment whenever we realized that the continuity that's provided to a patient needs to actually be team-based. And not that that's team-based, just that you have a doctor and that's your one and only doctor, and the doctor might have a nurse practitioner, but how does the patient actually connect with the NA? How does the patient connect with the resident that's there in the environment? How do we make sure that they're seeing, interacting with that same core group of people on an ongoing basis? And then creating that sense of ownership within the practice. We're going to go through some of the specifics of how this has gone and cover those next items, the shared vision, the impact, and the development as we look at the rest of the slides. So if you go to the next one, this is how we creatively engage them. So we create 3 teams within practice. You'll notice that each one of them is color-coded. They have done a great job of coming together around those colors. It was interesting at our Christmas party this past year, we actually had the blue team, that first team there, they actually all showed up to the Christmas party in blue shirts, dresses, ties, everything to try to get that sense of team communicated. It has created some healthy competition within the office. I wanted to point out that each of them then is asked to develop a logo or an item that represented their team. So really looking at that creativity or that emotional side that comes into all of the changes that take place at the practice. If you go to the slide, this comes. So this is a look at the data, and we had, you know, we could easily do 10 slides of data around this because we've looked at this so many different times. But we were looking at a specific outcome, more of a project-specific list of outcomes. And so we've brought together new components of the team. And so one of the changes we made was not to identify a physician leader, but to identify an administrative leader. And that's why I think Lynn and I were asked to share together, because we've created that administrative physician dyad to figure out how we get things done. And the compounding factor was the addition of IT innovation. And so bringing on someone who can actually create the dashboards, the metrics, the collection process to really pull all this together. So if you look there at the top, we have the individual results. So it wasn't necessarily about pulling project results, which all of us have looked at, and we've seen the outcomes, and then we put them out there for an individual provider and an individual team. But we took the project results, we them down into the team, but more specifically, that top slide, we can actually look at individual players within the team's role within a project of empanelment. From the time that phone call is made from a patient who is asking to schedule an appointment, what front desk person, and are they actually connecting and making the scheduled appointment with the direct empaneled team? And we then make sure that that's tracked. And then as soon as the data, it's not enough to track it, but you actually have to go through that data with the players and see now how that has brought the team together. So we create the colored teams, but then to see how our administrative team has come together. So they're actually getting together, reviewing the results, seeing what's happening, identifying where they can make changes, and it's allowed us to create a really good development. Because whenever we started through the process of transformation, you know, we much more, and in Judith, whenever she extended the invitation, said that we were wholesale, like we did a lot of wholesale changes. You know, and that meant that there were key things that we did in bulk. We looked at the chronic model, we identified the 5 areas we wanted to focus on, and we did a PDSA in each one of them. So we had the bulk component of the PDSAs, but where we got creative was when Sam's Club, you can also get snowshoes and a tent. You know, it's not just about getting food. Actually, what are those other things that are thrown into the mix? And so, you know, whenever we added a spiritual counselor to the mix, or whenever we added an additional a central processing unit or the IT innovations, it's really allowed us to bring that team together on what our results were going to be. And if you go to the next slide, this is just a highlight of it's finally working. So our patients are happy. The residents are seeing familiar patients as they come through the practice. The resident and staff are actually being integrated into the team, and so creating that dynamic of reliance on your team members, acknowledgement that residents and the learners are on their team, and how to get them incorporated, which has created a better learning outcome within primary care offices. Create a culture of accountability. So with the individual results, when those are presented, how do we make sure that that is leading to accountability and that sense of ownership that we want to make sure there? And then how do you use the data to validate and get a healthy competition in the practice? Our next slide, role. And if we look at leadership, there's a couple of these that I want to point out. We have relentlessness for excellence, that shared vision. And it wasn't until we actually took a step back and listened to what was going on and realized that we needed to disperse the responsibility into all levels of the team, that it wasn't necessarily going to be just that physician-led, physician-driven change where one person was going to get the results. We actually needed to make sure that every person knew the role, owned their part in the process, and passed on that torch of leadership that was going to make sure that the changes were then sustainable. And that we became an educating organization. So we went from telling people what to do to helping them understand and know what they needed to do, and where they're actually owning it and driving the changes that are continuing. We've also taken the philosophy of move on. So not, you know, once you identify that there is a problem, what do you do to fix it and move on to better things? And so that has helped us to not get stuck looking at one thing over and over again. it goes back to reintroducing that PDSA cycle, that PDSA mentality back into our mix. And then if you go to the last slide, are we sustaining this? So what's worked from previous projects is keeping the team motivated, engaged, and inspired, and we've learned that we can do that through data and through small things like the, pizza parties or lunch and learn opportunities, but real development of the visual management system. We've always had our run charts up on the wall, but now it's about how do we get to data that individuals at their desk can pull up and take a look at. We continuously monitor and sharing the metrics through our weekly staff meetings, touch points that are happening, as well as identifying the individual project team that's coming together. We've always stayed creative in how the team is going to work together, realizing that any of the resources that come through, shared savings payments or through payments through the innovations that are taking place are all used to organically grow the organization. So they're back in that we, bring the next level of innovation that's going to happen, because we learned that you can't rest on success, that we actually need to continue to innovate. So now that we've figured out the components of the empanelment project, how do we lead into and keep the momentum going by moving on to the next one? And I share with you that the P training that we've been doing with the staff in our medical home has actually now become part of our onboarding process. Everyone to our administration and our graduate medical education arm, all the way down into the person who's answering the front desk phone and incorporating those small tests of change and what are they going to do to improve the environment they're in every single day. That's a look from the right center as we look specific at empanelment. Welcome the opportunity to answer questions that folks have and realize that we actually came through this journey with a lot of heart and passion whenever it got up and rolling, and welcomed the opportunity to do something that was a little bit out there and a little bit different. And now, through a lot of hard work, now we're finally coming around to building that team dynamic and creating that team that everybody wanted to have within their healthcare environment. So thank you.
Thanks very much. This is Marie, and I can certainly hear that passion and that energy in your voice, and it's really great. And actually, that's causing me to think that that's another dimension, perhaps, of transformative change, where there is that creativity that you've described, and the energy and the passion that come along with it. And so I think that's a really notable feature of the work that you've done in the presentation. I want to encourage folks to chat in their questions. And one thing that I've been thinking about as I've been hearing Brian, but also reflecting on the other presenters is, does it matter what you're focusing on? So is change itself an important component here? So I'm thinking that you're talking about empowerment. Thad was talking about the patient-centered medical home as their sort of destination and their aim. Certainly hypertension that Andy was talking about. So are there some changes that, in a sense, require a more subtle or more multidimensional approach, and recognizing that is perhaps an important step in beginning a transformational journey. So maybe if people want to kind of respond to that, or if they've been involved in changes in their practices that they consider transformational, just kind of chat in what topics might have been. While we're waiting for questions, or comments, I'm wondering if you could talk about how the work that you did around empanelment that you described, how that carries over to other that you may have made since then or are now currently making. So certainly the team structure that you set up, it's like you really changed the way that people relate to improvement teams. But have you seen that carry over into other aspects of change that you've taken in the practice?
So thank you, Marie. This is Linda Thomas at the Right Center. And, I think that that's a phenomenal question because, we've learned a lot. And probably the core themes that have come through all of the practices is that the physician with hair on fire, usually has a pretty legitimate point, particularly if their hair's on fire because of patient advocacy and what's right for the practice and their patients, and for, the reduction of their daily frustrations, because usually their frustrations, if their patients are the same frustrations with the practice by the patients. And that what is really helpful is rather than the organization responding by, either hiding or poking the skunk, usually to kind of begin to translate is motivating that energy and that passion for change, and then begin to collectively, in a very nurturing way, build the team around the alleviation of shared frustrations and anxieties, and to really recognize that in order to get the team to that point of collective impact, it's really about developing people with a lot of integrity, and there needs to be investment in when you get the report cards and you're showing that there's insufficiencies, rather than gotcha culture, there really needs to be loving outreach from management to understand the noncompliance. Is it an issue staff don't understand the shared vision? Is it an issue where they don't really have insight into